People like you don't belong in an establishment like this, the sergeant said. His hand resting with practiced casualness on his duty belt, his voice carrying across the dining room with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no, loud enough to silence the jazz piano 3 tables away, loud enough to make crystal glasses stop mid-clink, loud enough to freeze every fork in the room between plate and mouth. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because 2 hours before those words were spoken, the Wellington was exactly what it was always meant to be, a sanctuary of quiet, almost theatrical perfection, the kind of place where the air itself seemed to understand the value of restraint. The chandelier above the main dining room was original, cast in 1924, cleaned by hand every 6 months by a specialist brought in from Vienna, its 1,000 individual crystals, throwing warm amber light across white linen tablecloths, and the polished faces of people who had spent entire lifetimes learning how to look comfortable in rooms like this one. The live jazz came from a Steinway grand piano tucked into the far corner, a young musician named David who played with the precise looseness of someone who had practiced being spontaneous for 10,000 hours. The air carried the faint, luxurious ghost of black truffle and aged burgundy and fresh lilies arranged in low crystal vases, never tall enough to interrupt the sight lines of conversation, never too fragrant to compete with the food. Every detail had been considered. Every detail had been paid for. Gabe Kensington sat in the owner's booth, a semi-private elevated alcove, draped in deep velvet curtains that offered a commanding view of the entire floor, while keeping its occupants wrapped in a privacy that felt almost conspiratorial. And he looked out at the dining room, the way a man looks at something he has built with his own hands and his own vision, and a great deal of quiet, patient money, which is to say, he looked at it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has no need to tell anyone what they are feeling, because the feeling is entirely sufficient on its own. He wore a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit with no tie, the collar of his white shirt open, just enough to suggest ease without sacrificing precision, and at his left wrist half hidden beneath the crisp line of his manchette. The face of a Patek Philippe caught the chandelier light and threw it back in a single discreet flash. Not an announcement, never an announcement, simply a fact about the man sitting there that most people in the room would never notice, and that Gabe had absolutely no interest in advertising. Josephine sat across from him in a deep emerald silk gown that moved with her like something alive, the fabric catching light differently every time she shifted her weight, and she was laughing at something Gabe had said. A real laugh, the kind that reached her eyes and briefly dismantled the formidable precision she usually carried like a second skin. Because tonight was their 10th wedding anniversary, and she had agreed for one evening to be simply his wife, rather than the woman who had spent 15 years dismantling Fortune 500 executives in federal court with the calm surgical efficiency of someone who had never once doubted she would win. They were without question the only black couple in the dining room. They were also without question the most elegantly dressed people in it, though Gabe had long since stopped noticing the particular arithmetic of those two facts existing simultaneously in the same space, because he had learned the way you learn things that cost you something to learn. That noticing it too loudly in your own chest was a form of tax that certain rooms charged certain people simply for walking through the door, and he had stopped paying it years ago. At the table immediately to their left, a family of 3 had settled in for the evening, a husband and wife in their early 40s. The kind of quietly prosperous couple who drove sensible luxury cars and coached Little League and knew their sommelier by first name, and between them, perched on 2 stacked seat cushions, with the absolute self-possession of a child entirely confident in her right to occupy any space she chose to enter, sat a girl of about 9 years old named Lily, who had dark copper-red hair and a gap between her 2 front teeth, and was currently drawing something extremely ambitious on the back of her menu with a stubby pencil she had produced from the pocket of her velvet dress. She had looked up when Gabe and Josephine were escorted to their table the way children look at adults directly, without the careful social machinery that makes adults look away. And she had smiled at Josephine with the open, uncomplicated warmth of someone who had not yet learned to parse a room by who was supposed to be in it. Josephine had smiled back. Gabe had noticed and had said nothing, and had felt something shift very slightly in his chest in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. The story of how Gabriel Kensington came to own the Wellington is not on its surface a dramatic one, which is precisely the way Gabe had always preferred it. He had built Kensington Enterprise Group over the course of a decade, through the kind of work that does not photograph well and does not generate press releases. The exhausting, meticulous, often unglamorous work of identifying undervalued commercial properties along the eastern seaboard, understanding exactly why they were struggling, assembling the right teams to address those specific problems, and then deploying capital with the patience of someone who understood that the most powerful investments were almost always the ones nobody else had the endurance to make. He did not appear on the covers of business magazines. He did not give keynote speeches. He did not maintain a social media presence of any kind. He operated as his general counsel once described him to a journalist who had been trying for 3 years to profile him like a highly effective, extraordinarily wealthy ghost. The Wellington had come to him 2 years prior through channels quiet enough that the transition of ownership had gone entirely unremarked upon in the local press. The previous owner, a man named Gerald Hartwell, whose family had operated the restaurant for 50 years, and whose name still appeared in raised gold letters above the private dining room, had gone quietly bankrupt after a series of decisions that combined optimism with poor mathematics in the specific way that tends to end generational businesses. Gabe had purchased the property through a subsidiary LLC, kept the entire staff, tripled their salaries across the board, brought in a Michelin-starred chef from Paris named Laurent, who had immediately and comprehensively reinvented the kitchen and spent $5 million on a restoration of the original 1920s architecture that was so faithful to the building's history that most of the regulars noticed only that everything seemed slightly more perfect than they remembered. To the staff, to the regulars, to the town of Fairfield County itself, the Wellington had simply gotten better. No one asked why. Expensive things becoming more expensive in wealthy towns rarely demands an explanation. Only 3 people at the Wellington knew that Gabriel Kensington was its owner: Laurent the chef, the head of security, and Oliver Ashford, the general manager. A meticulous silver-haired Englishman from Shropshire who had managed fine dining establishments in London, Hong Kong, and twice in New York before landing at the Wellington 8 years ago, and deciding with characteristic British understatement that Connecticut suited him perfectly well. What the staff did not know, what almost no one in Fairfield County knew, was the particular detail that would, in approximately 90 minutes, cause a 25-year veteran of the local police force to feel the specific physical sensation of the floor disappearing from beneath his feet. Kensington Enterprise Group owned the land beneath the South Precinct parking structure. Every squad car in the district sat every single day on concrete above earth that belonged to Gabe Kensington through a subsidiary called Keg Properties, LLC, whose lease with the county had been renewed quietly and without fanfare just the previous month. Gabe had not planned any of this as a trap. He had simply been paying attention for a very long time, and patience, in his experience, had a way of creating situations that other people tended to describe afterward as fate. Tonight, he was Mr. Davis. He had asked Oliver to instruct the staff to treat him as a VIP guest under that alias, to give him the owner's booth, and to behave as though the actual owner of the Wellington was as Gabe had told Josephine in the car on the way over, approximately 3,000 miles away. Nervous Josephine had asked, slipping her arm through his as they walked toward the entrance, the crisp November air carrying the smell of wood smoke and the first real cold of the season. About dining in my own restaurant, Gabe had said, and the quiet laugh in his voice was the laugh of a man who found genuine pleasure in the private jokes that only his own life could tell. Oliver Ashford received them at the host stand with the precise calibration of a man performing a role he could play in his sleep, while simultaneously managing 17 other things, a brief, almost imperceptible nod passing between him and Gabe that no one in the room would have identified as anything other than a manager acknowledging a guest which was technically exactly what it was. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Davis," Oliver said, his voice carrying the particular warm authority of a man who has spent 30 years making wealthy people feel immediately at ease. "It is an absolute pleasure to have you with us tonight. Your table is ready." He led them through the dining room personally, and Gabe walked with the unhurried ease of a man who had nowhere more important to be than exactly where he was. Which was true in a way that was also, on this particular evening, somewhat literal. He noticed, as he always noticed, the subtle machinery of the room adjusting to their presence. A slight stiffening at one table. A menu raised a fraction of an inch higher at another. The particular quality of silence that descends over a conversation when the people having it are suddenly very carefully not looking at something. The Wellingtons' clientele was with very few exceptions. Elderly, enormously wealthy, and white. A demographic reality that was less a policy than a residue, the accumulated sediment of half a century of operating as a place where certain people felt immediately, wordlessly, effortlessly at home, and certain other people received a different message entirely without anyone ever having to say it aloud. Gabe and Josephine were used to the looks. They had been used to the looks for years. There is a particular kind of dignity available to people who have decided at some point in their lives that other people's discomfort with their existence is not their responsibility to manage, and both of them wore it now with the ease of a second garment. Something put on so long ago it had simply become part of how they moved through rooms. They settled into the owner's booth, sinking into the deep dark leather, and the evening began in earnest. Champagne poured immediately, the roasted duck arriving with the kind of silent precision that signals a kitchen operating at the top of its ability. The conversation between them slipping easily into the particular intimacy of two people who have spent 10 years building a life together and still find each other genuinely interesting to talk to. For a full hour, the Wellington was everything Gabe had spent $5 million and 2 years of careful, patient work trying to make it. Then Lily at the table to their left ran out of green. She appeared at Josephine's elbow with the absolute unself-consciousness of a child who has not yet learned that approaching strangers requires a negotiation of social permissions, holding up her stubby pencil and her half-finished drawing, which appeared to be either a horse or a very optimistic dog, and asking with complete directness whether Josephine happened to have a green pen, because she had used all of hers, and the tree wasn't finished. Josephine looked at the drawing for a moment. Then she reached into her small clutch, found nothing useful, turned to the table, and picked up the full cup of colored pencils the hostess had left beside the breadbasket for exactly this purpose, and handed the entire cup to Lily without a word, just a smile. Lily took it, said thank you with the gravity of a child, accepting a significant gift, and carried it back to her table with both hands. Her father, embarrassed, leaned over toward Josephine and began to apologize for the interruption, and Josephine told him genuinely that there was absolutely nothing to apologize for. Gabe watched all of this from across the table, his champagne glass resting lightly in his fingers, and said nothing, and the security camera mounted discreetly in the upper corner of the alcove recorded all of it in high definition, the way it recorded everything. Not because anyone had expected to need it, but because Gabe Kensington had spent a decade in commercial real estate, learning that the most useful protections are always the ones installed before anything goes wrong. The jazz played. The chandelier threw its warm amber light across the white linen. Lily drew her tree. For another 20 minutes, everything was perfect. The mahogany doors of the Wellington opened with the kind of force that is not quite a slam, but is also definitively not the way those doors were designed to be opened, and Sergeant Dale Rourke stepped through them the way he stepped through most thresholds, as though the space on the other side had been expecting him and had simply failed to adequately prepare. He was a large man, Rourke, in the particular way of men who were powerfully built in their 30s and 40s, and have since added weight to that foundation without subtracting any of the swagger that the original architecture supported barrel-chested, thick-necked moving with the rolling shoulder-forward gait of someone who had spent 25 years making his physical presence the first thing any room understood about him. His hair was the color of old wheat, cut short in the military style he had maintained since the academy, though it had gone nearly white at the temples and was lacquered back from his forehead with a careful application of gel that suggested a man still trying to look like the version of himself he most approved of. His face was broad and perpetually flushed, the ruddy complexion of someone who had been drinking good scotch at bad hours for the better part of 3 decades, and his eyes were the particular flat blue of a man who has not seriously entertained the possibility of being wrong about anything in a very long time. He was off-duty. He wore a navy blazer that was perhaps one dinner too tight across the shoulders, khaki trousers with a sharp crease and loafers with tassels that had been expensive when purchased and were now simply old. He was accompanied by his wife Paulette, a thin, sharp-faced woman in a beige cardigan who carried herself with the reflected authority of a woman who had spent 25 years standing beside a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. And another couple, the Fergusons, loud and cheerful in the way of people who have had 2 drinks already and are optimistic about having several more. Rourke had been coming to the Wellington on and off for 15 years. Or rather, he had been coming to the Wellington as it existed in the geography of his own self-image, which was a place where the maitre d' knew his name, and the previous owner, Gerald Hartwell, had occasionally sent over a complimentary bottle of something old and expensive in recognition of various services rendered, most of them involving the tactical deployment of Rourke's particular position between the law as written and the law as locally practiced. He had not made a reservation. In Rourke's understanding of the world, reservations were things that other people needed. Clara Hennessy had been working the host stand for 8 months, fitting her shifts at the Wellington around her junior year at UConn, and she had encountered difficult guests. Before, this was fine dining in Fairfield County. Difficult guests were essentially the product offering, but something about the way Rourke moved toward her podium, the way his eyes didn't quite make contact with her eyes, but rather with the space slightly above and behind her, as though she were an obstacle rather than a person, made her fingers tighten involuntarily around the edge of her iPad. "Evening, sweetheart," Rourke said, not breaking stride until he was close enough that Clara had to resist the instinct to step back. "Table for 4, the good section, and tell the bartender we'll want martinis as soon as we're seated." Clara checked her screen, already knowing what she would find. "Good evening, sir. I'm so sorry we're fully booked for the evening. Do you have a reservation under a name?" The warmth drained from Rourke's expression the way heat leaves a room when a window breaks. He leaned one heavy forearm on the edge of her delicate host stand, and the stand flexed very slightly under the weight. "I don't need a reservation, honey," he said, his voice dropping into the register he used when he wanted to make very clear that pleasantries were over. "I'm Sergeant Rourke. I know the owner personally. Now find me a table, or I might have to send the fire marshal down here tomorrow to take a very close look at your occupancy situation. We wouldn't want that kind of disruption, would we?" Clara's mouth went dry. She looked past Rourke's shoulder toward the dining room, searching for Oliver, but Oliver was in the wine cellar with a sommelier and a rare 2009 Barolo that required his complete attention, and the dining room floor stretched between her and help with the particular unhelpfulness of distances in emergencies. Rourke did not wait. He simply walked past her stand and into the dining room, his party trailing behind him with the absolute ease of a man who had been walking past the people paid to stop him for his entire adult life. The dining room was full in every direction. Couples at the intimate two-tops near the windows, larger parties at the round tables in the center, every seat occupied by people halfway through multi-course meals and entirely settled into their evenings. Rourke scanned the floor with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to sizing up any room he entered for its hierarchy and its leverage points, and found nothing immediately available that satisfied either his appetite or his sense of what the evening owed him. Then his eyes moved upward toward the elevated alcove at the back of the room, and he stopped walking. The owner's booth was warm and beautifully lit, the velvet curtains pulled back just enough to frame the occupants like a painting champagne glasses catching the light. A bottle of something clearly expensive open on the table, the remnants of what had evidently been an exceptional dinner, arranged with the particular elegant disorder of a meal approaching its natural end. And sitting there, leaning slightly toward each other in the private, instinctive way of two people who have spent a decade learning the exact geometry of each other's company, were Gabe and Josephine Kensington. Something moved across Rourke's face that was not quite anger and not quite surprise, but was something older and less defensible than either the specific deep-bone indignation of a man confronting a reality that his understanding of the world has told him for 25 years should not exist. He had patrolled this county for a quarter century. He knew its architecture of belonging, who lived where, who ate where, who was given the benefit of the doubt, and who was watched, whose car parked in which driveway, and whose presence in which establishment triggered no particular response from anyone. The Wellington was not in this architecture a place where Gabe and Josephine Kensington were supposed to be sitting in the best seat in the room. He did not see a man who had spent a decade quietly assembling one of the most significant commercial real estate portfolios on the eastern seaboard. He did not see a woman who had argued cases before federal judges who still remembered her cross-examinations. He saw, with the confident blindness of a man whose prejudice had never once been meaningfully challenged, two people who had somehow gotten somewhere they did not belong, and he felt the familiar self-righteous itch of someone who considers it his job to correct such errors. "Unbelievable," he muttered to Paulette, who nodded with the automatic agreement of long practice. Probably won something. Come on. He went straight for the alcove steps, not waiting for a hostess, not looking for a manager, moving with the absolute assurance of a man who has spent his entire career in a world where momentum is authority and authority is everything. Gabe saw him coming before Rourke had climbed the first step because Gabe Kensington noticed things. It was along with patience and a willingness to do unglamorous work for long stretches without external validation. The foundational skill of his professional life. And he tracked the large man's approach with the quiet, measuring attention of someone who has learned that the quality of what is about to happen can usually be read in how a person crosses a room. He took a slow sip of his champagne and set the glass down. Josephine felt the shift in him and turned her head slightly. "Can I help you?" Gabe set his voice entirely level when Rourke arrived at the edge of their table. "Yeah, you can," Rourke said, crossing his arms, his blazer straining at the shoulders. "You can wrap up whatever you're doing here and clear out. My party needs this table." Josephine set down her fork with a precision that was its own kind of statement. "Excuse me, you heard me." Rourke's gaze moved across her with the dismissiveness of someone filing her under irrelevant before returning to Gabe, who had not moved, who had not shifted in his seat, who was looking at Rourke with the calm, patient attention of a scientist observing something that is doing exactly what its nature predicted it would do. "I don't know who you tipped at the door to get into this booth, but that ends now. This is a private establishment, and the people who actually belong here need somewhere to sit. So let's get moving. Chop, chop." Gabe did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He said simply and clearly, "We are in the middle of our anniversary dinner. We are not leaving. I suggest you return to the host stand and wait to be seated like everyone else." The color that climbed Rourke's face in the 3 seconds after that sentence was said was a deep, vivid crimson that started at the collar and moved upward with the speed and intensity of a man not accustomed to that word in that tone from that direction. The veins in his neck thickened visibly. He leaned forward over the table close enough that Gabe could smell the stale gin beneath the expensive cologne, and when he spoke again the word, he chose the single ancient weaponized syllable he deployed with the casual ease of a man reaching for a tool he had used so many times it had worn smooth in his grip. landed in the air between them like something with weight and heat, and the specific corrosive quality of a thing said not in anger but in absolute confident contempt. Boy. The word hung there. At the table immediately below the alcove, Lily set down her spoon. The small, clear sound of metal against porcelain was barely audible, but in the sudden total silence that had fallen over the portion of the dining room within earshot of Rourke's voice it carried, the girl turned her face toward the alcove, not frightened, not performing outrage, simply looking with the direct, uncomplicating attention of a child who has not yet learned to look away from things that feel wrong. And her eyes moved from Rourke to Gabe and stayed there steady and calm, and asked a question that she did not have the words for yet, but that was already living inside her with the clarity of something that would not leave. Her father put a hand on her shoulder and gently turned her back toward the table. Josephine's hand tightened around her napkin, and the litigator who had dismantled men far more powerful than Dale Rourke in rooms far more adversarial than this one, opened her mouth, but Gabe's hand covered hers. One smooth, unhurried motion, and the message that passed between them in that single point of contact was, let him keep going. Let him bury himself deeper. Hand him the shovel, and let him use it. Rourke reached into his blazer and produced his badge wallet, snapping it open so the gold shield caught the chandelier light and placed it on the edge of the table, with a sound that was meant to be definitive. Oliver Ashford emerged from the wine cellar staircase on the far side of the dining room, a 2009 Barolo successfully decanted, and the evening proceeding precisely as it ought to, and then he looked across the floor and saw the large man in the straining navy blazer standing over his employer's table with a badge on the tablecloth, and the blood that drained from Oliver's face did so with the speed and completeness of a man who has suddenly understood all at once the full dimensions of a problem. He crossed the dining room at a pace that was as fast as dignity and his professional self-image permitted, arriving slightly breathless at the bottom of the alcove steps. "Is there a problem here?" he said, positioning himself with careful precision between Rourke and the table, his crisp British accent cutting through the ambient noise of the room with the particular authority of a man who has spent 30 years learning how to make questions sound like statements. "Damn right there's a problem," Rourke said, turning on Oliver with the relief of a man finding a more familiar target. "These people are refusing to vacate this booth. I want it for my party. Tell them to pack up." Oliver looked at Gabe. Gabe looked back at him and delivered the signal they had agreed upon months earlier, in a quiet conversation about exactly these sorts of situations, a single, slow blink, deliberate and unhurried, that meant, do not reveal who I am, hold the line, give him nothing, let the situation develop on its own terms. Oliver swallowed, once adjusted his posture, and said, "Sergeant, I must ask you respectfully to step away from the table. Mr. and Mrs. Davis are valued guests of this establishment, and they are in the middle of their meal." Valued guests. Rourke repeated the phrase, landing in his mouth like something foreign and unpleasant. He looked around the booth at the champagne, at the remnants of the dinner, with the expression of a man cataloging evidence of an injustice. "I know the owner, Oliver. I know him personally. If he were standing here right now, he would personally remove these people from this booth and throw them onto the street for talking back to me. Now tell them to leave, or I will arrest them for trespassing and disturbing the peace." "Sir." And then Rourke continued, his voice rising to a volume that had now silenced tables well beyond the immediate vicinity of the alcove, his face fully crimson, one thick fist coming down on the wooden railing with a crack that made several guests visibly flinch. "I will personally ensure that every patrol car in this county parks outside this restaurant every single night and breathalyzes every customer who walks out those doors. Do you understand me? I will make it my personal mission to shut this place down." The threat sat in the room like something physical, an object that had been placed on the table of the restaurant and could not be taken back. It was extortion clean and explicit, delivered in front of a dining room full of wealthy witnesses, a general manager, and 2 weeks' worth of high-definition audio and visual recording equipment that Gabe Kensington had installed himself and which had been running without interruption since the moment the evening began. Josephine looked at Gabe. The trap was fully set. The man had dug it himself, furnished it himself, and climbed into it himself, and now there was nothing left to do but close it. Gabe stood up. He was an inch taller than Rourke, and though he carried none of the officer's beer-built mass, the quality of stillness he projected, when he straightened to his full height, was the kind that makes square footage feel different. The aura of a man whose power has never needed to audition for the room, who has arrived at his own authority through a process so long and so quiet that it has become indistinguishable from his actual character. "Arthur," he said. "Yes, sir," Oliver responded, and the sir landed in the room with a weight that shifted several things simultaneously. Gabe smoothed the cuffs of his Tom Ford suit with 2 small, deliberate gestures. "It appears Sergeant Rourke is determined to enforce the trespassing laws tonight," he said, his voice carrying easily through the absolute silence of the dining room without ever rising above a conversational register. "I think we should oblige him. Please call the police." Rourke let out a laugh, a hard, contemptuous bark of amusement. "Call the police? You're looking at the police, you idiot. I am the police." "Call the chief of police," Gabe said, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees, as his eyes found Rourke's and held them with the patient, unblinking attention of a man who has been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment. "Call Chief Patricia Donovan. Tell her that Gabe Kensington needs her at the Wellington immediately, and that one of her sergeants is threatening the owner of the property." The laughter died in Rourke's throat as though someone had cut a wire. He looked at Oliver. Oliver was already reaching for his radio. "Security, this is Ashford." Oliver said, his voice entirely steady. "Please contact Chief Donovan's emergency line immediately. Tell her Mr. Kensington requires her presence at the Wellington." "Yes, right now." Rourke's eyes moved from Oliver to Gabe, and back to Oliver, and the gears behind them were grinding through a calculation that was only now beginning to produce a number he recognized, a number that made no sense, and all the sense in the world simultaneously, a number that added up to the specific and catastrophic sum of a man who has just realized that the ground beneath him has never, not once in this entire evening, been as solid as he thought it was. Kensington Rourke said, and the name came out of him in a way that was no longer a word but a sound, the sound of a man beginning to fall. "The holding company," Rourke said, and the words came out slowly, haltingly, with the quality of a man reading something in a language he is only now learning. He should have studied the "You're the I am the man you just called boy," Gabe said quietly, stepping down from the alcove until he was standing on the same level as Rourke, close enough that the officer could see the absolute stillness in his face, the complete absence of anger or triumph or any of the emotions Rourke would have understood, replaced instead by something far more difficult to withstand, the cold, implacable clarity of a man who has been entirely right about everything since the moment Rourke walked through those mahogany doors. "I am the man whose property you just threatened to shut down. I am the man who employs every person in this building. And I am the man." He said, his voice dropping to a register that required the room to lean in to hear who owns the land beneath the South Precinct parking structure where every squad car in your district sits every single day through a subsidiary called Keg Properties, LLC, whose lease was renewed last month. The dining room was not merely quiet now, it was the particular silence of people who are witnessing something and understand with some deep wordless instinct that they will be describing this moment to people for years. Rourke took a half-step back. It was involuntary, a physical response to a cognitive collapse, the body trying to create the distance that the mind suddenly desperately needed. His hand went to his belt where his badge had been found only the table edge and dropped to his side. The couple who had walked in with him, the Fergusons, who had been standing at the base of the alcove steps watching the exchange with the gradual horror of people who had boarded what they believed to be a pleasant dinner boat, and are only now noticing the hull had already begun their quiet retreat toward the exit, moving with the particular sideways efficiency of people determined to be somewhere else before the accounting begins. Paulette had not moved, but the color had left her face so completely that she looked like a photograph of herself. Oliver stood behind Gabe with the quiet, straight-backed dignity of a man who has just been relieved of an enormous weight and replaced it with something he is proud to carry instead. At the surrounding tables, the shift in the room's understanding was visible in small physical ways. A woman in her 60s who had watched Gabe and Josephine's arrival with narrowed eyes was now looking at Rourke with an expression of barely contained revulsion, her menu placed flat on the table in front of her, as though she no longer needed the prop. A man at the nearest table had put his phone face up on the linen, its camera quietly running. Gabe did not say anything further. He simply looked at Rourke with the patient, waiting attention of a man who has made his point and is comfortable letting it settle. "You're bluffing," Rourke said. But the word came out hollow, scraped clean of conviction, the last argument of a man who has already lost and knows it. "This is a stunt. Kensington Enterprise Group is a massive," Arthur Gabe said without looking away from Rourke. "How long has the county leased the South Precinct parking structure?" 10 years, mister," Kensington Oliver said promptly and clearly. "The lease is held through Keg Properties, LLC. It was renewed last month for an additional 7 years. The sound that Rourke made was not quite a word and not quite a breath. It was the sound of a particular architecture of self-belief encountering a load it was never designed to carry. Chief Patricia Donovan arrived in 11 minutes, which was fast enough to suggest that she had not waited for the car to fully stop before moving toward the entrance. She was a compact, decisive woman in her mid-50s who wore her dress uniform with the ease of someone for whom it is working clothes rather than costuming, and she had come directly from a mayoral charity dinner 2 blocks away, which meant that the town's most senior law enforcement official walked through the Wellington's mahogany doors while the canapes were still being cleared from the event she had just left, because when Gabriel Kensington's name came across her emergency line attached to the words, "One of your sergeants," she had understood immediately that whatever was happening at the Wellington was not a misunderstanding. She walked through the dining room without looking at Rourke, crossed directly to Gabe and extended her hand. "Mr. Kensington, I apologize for the disruption to your evening. Tell me what happened." Rourke stepped forward. "Chief, listen, this is completely out of context. I came in here for dinner and there was a situation with the seating, and I was simply trying to Rick. Chief Donovan said his name the way you would say, 'Stop,' and he did." She did not look at him when she said it. She kept her eyes on Gabe, waiting. Gabe gestured toward the ceiling above the owner's booth. 2 weeks ago, I installed high-definition audio and video recording equipment throughout this dining room for the protection of my staff and my patrons. Oliver, please pull up the feed from camera 4. Oliver produced an iPad, tapped twice, and handed it to Chief Donovan. She watched the screen in silence for 90 seconds. The audio was crisp and entirely unambiguous, and the room was quiet enough that the people at the nearest tables could hear it too. The specific, weaponized syllable, the explicit threat about patrol cars and fire marshals and shutting the place down. And Chief Donovan's jaw tightened incrementally with each passing second, until when she handed the tablet back to Oliver, the muscles at the corners of her mouth were doing the particular work of a person exercising very deliberate control over what her face was communicating. Josephine stepped down from the alcove. She moved without hurry, the emerald silk of her gown catching the chandelier light as she descended, and she took her place beside her husband, with the quiet, absolute assurance of a woman who has spent 15 years in rooms designed to intimidate her and has not once found them capable of doing so. She had been patient all evening. She had been still. She had let her husband manage the tempo of the confrontation with the restraint and the long-game intelligence that she had loved in him for a decade. And now the moment had arrived for her particular set of skills, and she brought them to bear with the clean, economic efficiency of a surgeon who has been waiting for the right moment to make the incision. "Chief Donovan," she said, and her voice was not loud, but it was the kind of voice that changes the acoustic properties of a room by simply occupying it. "Let us be entirely clear about what occurred here tonight." She looked at Rourke. He actually stepped back. Sergeant Rourke did not cause a disturbance. Josephine said, her legal mind laying out the architecture of his culpability with the precision of someone who has done this before much better defended targets. He walked into a private establishment without a reservation and attempted to intimidate a junior employee into surrendering seating she was not authorized to surrender. When that failed, he approached a guest, my husband, and demanded, using a racial slur, that he vacate a table he had reserved and paid for. When my husband declined, Sergeant Rourke explicitly threatened to deploy municipal police resources against this business as personal retaliation. That is not a misunderstanding. That is coercion. That is an abuse of the authority of his office. And because he was off duty, acting with malicious personal intent and explicitly violating the constitutional rights of my husband and myself, there is no qualified immunity that protects him from what comes next. The dining room had gone so quiet that the candle flames on the nearest tables were the loudest thing in the room. Chief Donovan looked at Rourke for a long moment with the eyes of someone who has spent 5 years trying to modernize a department corroded by exactly the kind of old guard corruption standing in front of her. And she said, "Rick, your badge and your weapon. Now." Rourke's hands were shaking when he reached for his belt. It was visible from every table within line of sight, the tremor in the thick scarred fingers, the way he had to make 2 attempts to unclip the badge holder, the heavy slow motion of a man performing an action whose full implications are arriving at different speeds from different directions, none of them welcome. He held the gold shield for a moment before handing it over, looking at it with the expression of a man saying goodbye to something he had believed genuinely and without examination was simply part of who he was. Then he unholstered his off-duty firearm, a compact Glock 27, and cleared the chamber with fingers that fumbled once on the slide, the single round dropping into his palm, where he stared at it briefly before handing the weapon to Chief Donovan grip first. He had carried a gun for 25 years. He had never not once imagined handing it over like this. "You are suspended without pay, effective immediately pending an internal affairs investigation," Chief Donovan said, securing both items with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman completing an administrative task rather than ending a career, though both things were true simultaneously. "You will surrender your precinct keys and your patrol vehicle at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Effective immediately, you are trespassing on private property. Please leave Mr. Kensington's restaurant." Rourke looked around the room for the last time. The long, slow sweep of a man doing an inventory of his situation, searching for a friendly face for someone who would offer the validation. The shared nod, the quiet signal of, "I understand, I'm with you," that had been available to him in rooms like this one for the entirety of his adult life. There was nothing. The older couple who had once been this restaurant's most reliable demographic of uncritical welcome were looking at him with open, undisguised disgust. The man with his phone on the table had not stopped recording. Paulette had already walked out the front doors without looking back, and the sound of her departure had been in its own way its own verdict. Rourke began the walk to the exit. It was not a long walk in terms of physical distance, perhaps 40 feet from the base of the alcove to the mahogany doors, but it had the quality of a much longer journey, and he took each step with the particular mechanical determination of a man who has been reduced to simply putting one foot in front of the other because the other options have all been taken away. He was almost to the doors when Gabe's voice reached him. "Sergeant." Rourke stopped. He looked back over one shoulder, and the face he showed the room was a face stripped of everything that had walked through those doors 45 minutes ago. The swagger, the certainty, the absolute unquestioned confidence that the world had been arranged in a particular order and that he occupied a specific protected position within it. What remained was the face of a man confronting what he actually was, perhaps for the first time. Gabe stood at the base of the alcove steps, his hands at his sides, his expression entirely neutral. "The bill for your drinks at the bar will be mailed to your home address," he said. "I expect it paid in full. Good night." The mahogany doors closed behind Dale Rourke with a sound like a full stop at the end of a very long sentence. For 3 seconds, the Wellington was entirely silent. Then David at the Steinway picked up the thread of the melody he had set down 30 minutes ago and resumed it exactly where he had left off, as though the interruption had been nothing more than a brief pause in something that was always going to continue. At the table below the alcove, Lily picked up her pencil, leaned over her drawing, and with great care and concentration finished the tree. Dale Rourke woke at 6:17 to the specific quality of silence that descends on a house when the person who usually occupies it alongside you has decided without announcement to reorganize the future. The 4-bedroom colonial on Whitmore Drive had cost $340,000 in 2003 and was now worth nearly $1 million, a fact Rourke had taken as confirmation that the world was arranged in his favor, rather than a reflection of a real estate market operating entirely independently of his merit. The 2-car garage housed his truck and Paulette's Lexus, and in the driveway alongside the flagstone path, his 24-foot Sea Ray boat sat under a fitted cover, like a monument to a particular version of himself that had felt until approximately 9 o'clock the previous evening entirely secure. He found Paulette in the master bedroom, dressed already, a slate-gray Samsonite suitcase standing upright in the center of the room with the finality of punctuation. "My sister's house in Stamford," she said before he could ask. Her voice stripped of every quality it had possessed for 25 years of marriage, the shrill entitled edge, the reflexive solidarity, the willingness to believe whatever version of events he presented, because it was easier and because she had, at some point so long ago she could no longer identify it, stopped looking too closely at the man she had chosen. "My phone has not stopped since 6 o'clock this morning. The PTA, the country club, the Hendersons, the Marshes, the Delgados. All of them, same link." She did not look at him when she spoke. She zipped the suitcase with a single committed motion. Rourke picked up his iPad from the nightstand, and his hands, which had trembled handing over his badge the night before, trembled again now, and for reasons that were if anything more damaging than the first time. The Fairfield Chronicle's homepage loaded with the particular indifference of a news site that does not know or care whose life it is rearranging. "Local sergeant caught on tape in racist tirade against prominent real estate developer and philanthropist." The headline ran in the largest font the site used, and beneath it, a high-definition still frame from camera 4, his own face, broad and crimson and leaning aggressively over the white linen of Gabe Kensington's table, caught in the specific millisecond of maximum incrimination with the visual clarity of a security system installed by a man who understood exactly what he was installing it for. Cynthia Adler had been the Fairfield Chronicle's senior reporter for 11 years, and she had transcribed the audio with the merciless precision of a woman who had been covering the county's law enforcement for long enough to recognize on first listen that what she was hearing was not an isolated incident, but an illustration of a pattern, and she had written it accordingly, 3,000 words that detailed not only the events of the previous evening, but the broader history of a county that had allowed men like Dale Rourke to operate without consequence for a generation. The article ran 3 paragraphs on Josephine's litigation background. It noted that the Kensington Foundation had donated more than $8 million to the county's children's hospital over the preceding 5 years. It included, near the bottom, a single sentence about the South Precinct parking structure that Rourke read 3 times before setting the iPad down on the mattress with the careful, deliberate motion of a man trying very hard not to throw it through a wall. Clara Hennessy had been home by midnight, and she had sat at her kitchen table for 45 minutes with her phone in her hand and the Security Systems Management app open, thinking about what she had seen and what she had not done and what she was able to do now. And she had recorded the screen and sent it to the email address she found in 30 seconds of searching. And then she had made herself a cup of tea and gone to bed because it had felt like the most straightforward decision she had made all week. Frank Russo called, Paulette said from somewhere behind him. He said to call immediately. He sounded furious. She picked up the handle of her suitcase. "Don't call me Rick." She walked out of this bedroom, and he did not try to stop her because he was already dialing. Frank Pelham, who had taken over as president of the local Police Benevolent Association from Frank Russo 18 months ago, a distinction Rourke had never bothered to update in his mental address book, answered on the second ring, with the voice of a man who had been awake since before the paper hit the driveway and had been having in the hours since a series of increasingly uncomfortable phone calls. Frank Rourke said, and he could hear the desperation in his own voice and could not stop it. "Frank, tell me we have something. Tell me we're filing an emergency grievance because they can't do this. There has to be process. There has to be Rick." Pelham's voice was flat in the way that voices are flat when the person speaking has made a decision and is not interested in revisiting it. "I'm sitting here with the executive board and lead counsel. I've watched the tape 3 times. I want you to understand something before I say the rest of this. I have watched the tape 3 times, and each time I watched it, I could not find a single angle from which what you did is defensible. Not one. I have rights," Rourke said, and even as the words left him, he could hear how they sounded, the reflexive, hollowed-out claim of a man reaching for a tool that has always worked before and is only now discovering that tools have conditions. "I've paid dues for 25 years. We will provide mandated administrative representation for your internal affairs interview," Pelham said, cutting through him with the clean efficiency of a man reading from a decision already made. "That is the extent of our legal obligation, and that is the extent of what we will provide. We are not backing you publicly. We are not contesting the suspension. The Fraternal Order is issuing a statement at noon, condemning your conduct. You threatened a billionaire with department resources on high-definition video with crystal-clear audio, and you used a racial slur while doing it. And you did all of this in a room full of wealthy witnesses who are this morning talking to every journalist who will return their calls." A pause. "You're not just finished, Rick. You are the reason I've spent the last 4 hours explaining to the governor's office why our entire department shouldn't be reviewed. You're completely on your own." The dial tone arrived before Rourke had finished processing the sentence before it. He sat at the kitchen table in the Colonial House on Whitmore Drive for 6 minutes, which was the amount of time it took him to understand that the blue wall, the structure of mutual protection, of collective silence, of the unspoken agreement that the institution closes ranks around its own, regardless of what its own has done, had not merely declined to protect him. It had, with the self-preserving efficiency of an organism responding to a threat to its survival, been used to barricade him out. The internal affairs interview happened at 1 o'clock that afternoon in a windowless room that smelled of industrial cleaner and the particular staleness of rooms where bad days happen regularly. Captain Robert Hayes sat across from Rourke with a laptop opened. It turned it to face the man across the table and pressed play, and for the next 14 minutes neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the video had not already said more clearly and completely than either of them could manage. By 3 o'clock, Dale Rourke was formally terminated. His badge and weapon were catalogued in the evidence room with the procedural neutrality of any other piece of evidence, which is what they now were. The weight of 25 years reduced to 2 line items on a form. 3 days later, a process server knocked on the door of the Colonial on Whitmore Drive at 10:15 in the morning, and Rourke, who had not been sleeping and had not been eating with any consistency, and who had spent the intervening days learning the specific grinding texture of a life in freefall, answered the door in yesterday's clothes and was handed a document package bound in the midnight blue covers that Josephine Kensington's firm had used for their filings for 15 years. Kensington versus Rourke, filed in Federal District Court, 47 pages. What Josephine had built was not a lawsuit in the conventional sense. It was a forensic dismantling of a career executed with the patience and architectural precision of someone who had spent 15 years learning exactly how these structures hold together and exactly where to apply pressure until they don't. She had not filed in anger. She had filed with the deliberate calm of a woman who had known from the moment Rourke's word landed in the air of the dining room precisely what the next several months of her professional life would look like. The private investigators she hired spent 3 weeks and found Michael Webb, a 23-year-old graduate student who had been walking home from the library 5 years ago when Rourke had stopped him, held him against a patrol car for 40 minutes while running his name 6 times through the system, and ultimately arrested him on a loitering charge that had been dismissed 3 weeks later by a judge who noted in writing that the arresting officer's justification was insufficient to constitute probable cause. Michael Webb had not had the money or the connections to pursue the matter further. Now he had Josephine Kensington. They found Sandra Reyes, who owned a small catering business 4 blocks from the South Precinct, and who had been providing, under sustained and explicit pressure from Rourke's periodic visits over the course of 7 years, complimentary meals for the officer and his friends, under the implicit threat of what she described in her sworn deposition as a level of parking enforcement attention that would have made it impossible for my delivery vehicles to operate. She had told no one because she had not believed that telling anyone would change anything. She had, it turned out, simply been waiting for the right person to ask. Josephine added Webb and Reyes and 3 others as co-plaintiffs in an amended complaint that transformed a single incident of racial harassment into something considerably more difficult to minimize or dismiss a documented record of a man who had spent a quarter-century treating his badge as a license to extract, intimidate, and harm people he had calculated could not effectively fight back, and who had been permitted to continue doing so because no one with sufficient resources had ever been in the room when he did it. Until Tuesday evening at the Wellington. The city's legal department reviewed the filings and issued a statement within 48 hours, because Rourke had been off duty acting outside any legitimate law enforcement purpose and in explicit violation of established constitutional protections. The city would not provide indemnification. He was personally liable. Every penny. Rourke contacted William Carter, the most prominent defense attorney in Fairfield County, a man who had extricated clients from situations that looked from the outside entirely unexitable. And Carter took the meeting, reviewed the filings for 90 minutes, and asked for $150,000 as a retainer before he would file an appearance. Rourke did not have it. His accounts had been frozen by the federal litigation. Brenda had retained her own attorney and moved quickly to separate their joint assets and the financial architecture of 25 years of a specific kind of living. The overtime that was not always overtime. The favors that were not always favors. The accumulated material comfort of a life built partly on the unaudited exploitation of a position was revealing itself under the examination of multiple legal processes operating simultaneously to be considerably less solid than it had appeared from the inside. By the time the settlement was finalized 6 months after the evening at the Wellington, Dale Rourke owned nothing that could not fit in a medium-sized rental truck. The Sea Ray was sold at a public auction on a Tuesday morning that Rourke did not attend because he could not make himself watch it go. The Colonial on Whitmore Drive was listed and sold, the equity drained entirely into a federal trust established to pay the civil judgments of Michael Webb, Sandra Reyes, and the 3 other plaintiffs. His municipal pension, the golden inviolable egg of 25 years of service. The thing he had believed with perfect confidence was beyond anyone's reach, was heavily garnished by a federal judge to satisfy the remaining obligations with a note in the judgment that Rourke's conduct had demonstrated a pattern of behavior warranting extraordinary remedies. His state peace officer certification was permanently revoked. He could never wear a badge again anywhere in the United States for the rest of his life. True to their character, Gabe and Josephine did not keep a single dollar of the settlement. Every cent was directed into a legal defense fund for young people in the county who found themselves in the position that Michael Webb and Sandra Reyes had been in, people who had been wronged by someone with power and who had until now had no realistic path to accountability. Rourke found a studio apartment in Bridgeport for $940 a month and sat in it the first night with 2 bags of groceries and the specific disorienting quiet of a man who has had for 25 years the constant ambient noise of authority. Radios, squad cars, the institutional hum of a department that knew his name and who is now sitting in a second-floor walk-up that smells of old carpet and the neighbors cooking with nothing around him, making any sound at all. 2 years is not a long time in the accounting of most things, not long enough to fully forget, not long enough to fully become someone else, but it is long enough to understand, with the grinding clarity of lived experience, the difference between the world as you imagined it and the world as it actually operates when the protections you assumed were permanent have been removed. Dale Rourke worked the 10 to 6 shift for Apex Security Solutions, which was a large, faceless third-party contractor that staffed the overnight positions at commercial buildings across the tri-state area, and which had the particular advantage from Rourke's perspective of not running deep character checks for graveyard shift roles in subterranean parking garages. His uniform was a mustard yellow polyester blazer that retained heat in an unpleasant way and released it in a way that was worse paired with black slacks that had never been hemmed to his height, and a plastic name tag that said Dale in capital letters, which was the entirety of his professional identity in this phase of his life. He carried no weapon. He had no badge. He possessed in the execution of this role exactly 0 authority over any person or situation he encountered. His assigned post was the underground parking garage and loading dock of the Sovereign, a newly completed ultra-luxury residential tower in downtown Stamford, which was populated by precisely the category of person that had once constituted Rourke's understanding of his social peers: wealthy, powerful, moving through the world with the confident ease of people whose daily existence does not require them to think about who is watching and who now moved through the space. He monitored without registering his presence in any meaningful way, the way people do not register the presence of furniture. On a Tuesday night in mid-November, with the garage cold enough that his breath showed and his knees aching in the specific deep-bone way that comes from 25 years of carrying too much weight over too many miles of patrol, Beat, a resident on the 11th floor, called the security desk to report a suspicious individual near the elevators on the lower parking level. Rourke took the call and walked to the elevator bank, and what he found was a young man, 20, maybe 21, in a hoodie and jeans, standing entirely still with his phone out, clearly waiting for the elevator, who looked up at Rourke's approach with the particular prepared wariness of a young black man who has learned through accumulated experience what to do when a security guard walks toward him in a parking garage late at night. Rourke stopped walking about 6 feet away. He stood there for a moment. That was for him considerably longer than its clock measurement, because inside it he was standing at a door he had walked through 10,000 times in 25 years, a door that opened onto a very specific and well-practiced set of responses: the demand for ID, the invented justification, the deployment of the institutional weight of the uniform to make the encounter into whatever he needed it to be. He asked for the young man's ID. The young man produced it. His jaw set, his eyes steady. Rourke checked the name against the visitor log on his tablet. It was there, entered at 7:15 by the resident of apartment 1807. Floor 18, Rourke said. Elevator on the left. The young man looked at him for a half-second longer than necessary. not suspicion, just the natural pause of someone recalibrating a predicted outcome, said thanks, and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Rourke stood in the empty garage and looked at the closed elevator doors for a moment, and then he turned and walked back to his post, and nobody saw what had happened, and there was no reward for it, and it required no speech and no dramatic confession, and no formal ceremony of redemption. It was simply a choice made quietly in a cold basement by a man who was trying, in the only way still available to him, to become something marginally better than what he had been. 40 minutes later, the soft chime of the VIP elevator broke the particular silence of the garage at 11:50 on a Tuesday night, and Rourke, who had been standing near the service bay with his thermos of gas station coffee, looked up. Gabriel Kensington stepped out. He wore a midnight blue overcoat over a charcoal suit, and he was accompanied by two men in dark jackets, carrying leather portfolios. Structural engineers from the look of the rolled drawings visible above the portfolio clasps. And he was speaking to one of them in the focused, low-register way of a man conducting business with complete attention. Because Gabe Kensington, who owned the Sovereign through Kensington Enterprise Group's newest residential acquisition, made a practice of late unannounced inspections of properties where foundation work was ongoing, because the most important things about a building are almost always below what is visible. Rourke moved before the rational portion of his brain could complete its assessment of the situation. He turned toward the wall, pulled the brim of his plastic security cap down over his eyes, and focused his attention on the red fire alarm pull station on the cinder block wall in front of him, with the intensity of a man who has found in a piece of standard safety equipment an object of consuming professional interest. He heard the footsteps cross the garage floor, 3 sets initially heading toward the far end, where the engineering drawings would have the most useful wall space, and then 2 sets continuing and 1 set pausing, and then that single set of footsteps turning and crossing the floor with the unhurried, deliberate rhythm of very expensive shoes on polished concrete and stopping. Rourke did not move. The silence in the garage had the specific density of a silence that is being maintained on purpose by both of the people inside it. "Good evening," Gabe said. His voice was exactly what Rourke remembered the calm, resonant baritone of a man whose authority had never needed volume to make itself understood, carrying easily through the cold air of the underground space without effort or performance. Rourke's eyes closed for a moment. 1 breath in, 1 breath out. He turned around. He removed his plastic security cap with both hands because it felt in this moment like the least he could do. A small, inadequate gesture toward the truth of the situation, which was that there were no props left, no uniform that meant anything, no title to stand behind, nothing between the man he had been and the man he was now, and the man standing in front of him, who had seen both versions with complete clarity. He could not make himself look at Gabe's face. He looked instead at the Windsor knot of his silk tie, which was knotted with a precision that seemed, under the circumstances, to carry an additional weight. "Mr. Kensington," he said, and the voice that had thundered through the Wellington's dining room 2 years ago came out now as something barely above a whisper, sanded down by 2 years of a life designed to demonstrate, with daily physical specificity, exactly how much of himself had been constructed out of the authority he no longer possessed. Gabe studied him, not with cruelty, not with the hot satisfaction of a man watching his enemy diminished, but with something cooler and more honest than either of those things, the steady, evaluating gaze of a man taking an accurate measurement. His eyes moved briefly to the embroidered patch on Rourke's left shoulder. Apex Security Solutions. He knew the company. He had signed their service contract for this building 14 months ago. "I see you found work with Apex," Gabe said. The full weight of that landed on Rourke in layers, each one arriving slightly after the one before it. The man he had threatened to throw out of a restaurant was the man who had indirectly and without any awareness of the irony been signing the paychecks that kept him from sleeping in his car. The cosmos had a particular sense of structure, it turned out. and it had no interest in whether you found it funny. "Yes, sir," Rourke said, and the words tasted exactly the way he deserved them to taste. "Just keeping my head down, doing the work." Gabe was quiet for a moment. Not a punishing silence, simply the quiet of a man choosing his words with the same care he brought to everything else. "This building houses good people," he said, his voice settling into the even, authoritative register of a property owner addressing someone in his employ. "People who work hard, who treat each other with respect, who deserve to feel safe in the spaces they come home to. I expect everyone on the security team to treat them accordingly. Every person who walks through those doors, without exception." Rourke swallowed. The lump in his throat was large and dry and had been there in one form or another for 2 years. "I understand, sir," he said. "Perfectly." Gabe held his gaze for one more moment. Not long, not dramatic, simply long enough to make the understanding mutual and complete. And then he turned, walked back to his engineers, spoke briefly to the one holding the drawings, and moved with them toward the town car, idling at the far end of the garage. The red taillights flared once as the vehicle reached the ramp. Then they were gone. Dale Rourke stood alone in the cold, bright, empty garage, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the only sound around him, his plastic name tag sitting crookedly against the mustard yellow of his lapel. He looked at it for a long moment. He straightened it carefully with 2 fingers, and then he went back to work. 2 years after the night at the Wellington, the restaurant was thriving in the way that certain things thrive when they have been freed from the weight of what they were never supposed to be in the first place. Fully booked 6 weeks out, reviewed in 2 national publications, and staffed almost entirely by people Gabe had recruited from the county's most underserved communities, tripling the demographic range of the room in the way that good food and fair wages tend to do when the people responsible for creating the environment actually want it to happen. The Kensington Foundation's Legal Defense Fund had protected 14 young people in the county over those 2 years, 14 cases in which someone with power had counted on the person they were harming not being able to afford the truth. Josephine handled 3 of them personally pro bono between her other work because she had decided on the night Rourke walked out of the mahogany doors that she was finished outsourcing accountability to other people. At a community center kicking off events this past fall, an arts and education space funded entirely by the Kensington Foundation and housed appropriately in a building that had been empty and deteriorating for years before Kensington Enterprise Group acquired and restored it. A girl of 11 with copper-red hair stood at a small podium and read aloud a short piece she had written about why she wanted to study law. Her parents were in the 3rd row, and afterward her mother found Josephine near the back of the room and told her something that Josephine has not stopped thinking about since that for weeks after the evening at the Wellington Lily had been unable to sleep. Not from fear, but from a question she could not resolve. One she had asked her parents repeatedly until they ran out of ways to answer it. Why did that man tell the other man he wasn't allowed to sit there when the other man was the one who built the chair? And then her mother said quietly, "I think she already knows what she wants to do about it." The mahogany doors of the Wellington open every evening at 6 o'clock exactly as they have for 50 years, and they do not ask anything of the people who walk through them, except that they come hungry and leave well. That was always the only requirement. It just took the right owner to make it true. If this story moved you, please like and share it and subscribe to our channel, because the next story is already waiting and it will stay with you just as long.